Okay, looks like everyone's joined in, so let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our 2050 Metropolitan Transportation Plan Technical Workshop Series, the first of 2025. So my name is Taylor Laurent, and I'm serving as the 2050 Metropolitan Transportation Plans Project Manager. This 2050 MTP Technical Workshop Series will serve as our forum for focused and detailed group discussions on the technical components of the 2050 plan. And we have a wide group of workshop participants with us. We have representatives from Orange, Osceola, and Seminole counties, our 20 cities and towns, Lynx, the Florida Department of Transportation, as well as the Florida's Turnpike Enterprise, Central Florida Expressway Authority, our 3 airports, and the Federal Highway Administration. Thank you for everyone for signing in this afternoon to join this workshop. So in terms of our agenda today, we're going to be beginning with a brief overview of the ongoing work efforts to develop the MTP, then reviewing the cost estimation methodology for the MTP. An introduction to the funding scenario work we'll be completing this year, as well as reviewing the initial survey results and a discussion about future financial policies. These topics will be followed by an open discussion, public comments, and then a review of next steps. And we do have a great many people signed into the webinar today, and I'm still seeing more signing in. So I do ask that if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box or the chat pod at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we will be pausing periodically throughout the presentation for discussion and questions. So please use the raise your hand feature, also located at the bottom of your screen, to let us know that you have a question you'd like to ask verbally. We will answer these questions as time permits throughout our presentation during those brief pauses between our agenda sections. And if we don't make it to them during those brief pauses, we will revisit them again during our open comment period towards the end of the meeting. I thank you in advance for your understanding. So with that, I'll begin with the updates on our 2050 MTP. So we are continuing our coordination with the Florida Department of Transportation's Central Florida Regional Planning Model Team, as they are making some changes to their overall project schedule to allow for more thorough engagement in the region to really dial in that socioeconomic data and subsequent elements of the model. We do not yet have a revised schedule for what that new process is going to be moving forward, but hopefully we'll have a little more to share with you in time for our next meeting. In terms of the technical reports for the 2050 MTP, those are nearing completion, and they will be posted online to the 2050 MTP website as they are finished. Then in terms of our multimodal needs assessment, our transportation to-do list, as I affectionately refer to it, that is also nearing its completion. Thank you again to everyone throughout our region, all of our transportation partners who assisted with the reviews of this massive undertaking. And with the needs assessment being complete, we are in the process of applying the prioritization methodology, which we discussed at length late last year, and applying that to the projects on that multimodal needs assessment and finalizing the methodology report. So we'll be able to talk about those results in the coming weeks. And looking at our schedule, we're at a bit of an inflection point here where we begin to bring all of the information and decisions that we've made up to this point in the MTP development process together to inform our next task, which is our funding scenario evaluation work. This task will lead into the development of our cost feasible plan later this year as we prepare to adopt the entirety of the 2050 MTP in December of 2025. However, before I get ahead of myself and steal the thunder of our presenters, I will turn the presentation over to Laura Bauk to present on the cost estimation methodology applied to the MTP. Laura?
Thank you, Taylor. You can go ahead to the next slide. So over the last few months, we've had a team that was charged with establishing methodology for estimating costs for each of the projects that were identified through that needs assessment Taylor just mentioned. This is a necessary step as we prepare to develop our fiscally constrained cost feasible plan. So the 2050 MTP cost cost estimation methodology is really pivoting off of what we did for the 2045 MTP while incorporating some additional elements that aim to add some confidence to the estimates that were included in that cost feasible plan. I think rising costs, project costs have been a challenge for all of us over the last several years. So our cost estimation team was really keen on sort of future proofing these planning level cost estimates to the extent possible. Next slide, please. So the methodology for developing the cost estimates consisted of three broad steps that I'm going to walk through in turn. So that you go to the next slide, Taylor. So our preliminary step was really a best practices review, where we looked at the cost estimation methodologies from 5 other MPOs or TPOs. 4 of those 5 were Florida-based, as you can see, and we reviewed them to identify some potential improvements to that 2045 cost estimation methodology. That review observed each of the plan's unique methodologies, as well as benefits and limitations that we saw. And among the major takeaways that we found were, number one, most of the plans, particularly the Florida-based ones, obviously utilized the FDOT long-range estimate tool or some similar tool to develop their cost estimates. And then the other major takeaway was that we should share preliminary cost estimates with our local agency partners during our coordination for the needs assessment to allow for them to compare what we'd come up with for that base cost estimate with any potential local agency estimates they may have, and to also build in a mechanism for us to get their feedback on cost magnitude. Next slide, please. Moving from there, we got into the actual cost estimation, and our initial step there had 2 methods. So for those projects where we had planning level costs already developed as part of a separate planning effort, we used those costs. So our projects that were identified during the development of the TISMO master plan, as well as those that were identified through the various Vision Zero safety action plans fell into that category, that A category. For the remaining projects, we used per mile cost estimates. So all of the estimates that were identified during the needs assessment, pardon me, were categorized into several needs types. And those needs types were selected to be broad enough to represent a significant handful of the over 2,000 records that we ended up with, but were granular enough to show some cost differentiation. So from there, we were able to apply a per mile cost by needs type to each of those projects, and the per mile costs were calculated based on FDOT cost per mile models. Next slide, please. We developed a couple slides just to walk through an example where our example here is we're talking about building a new sidewalk. So we start with our project cost equation. That's that top blue line with the white writing, where we're using our FDOT cost per mile model times the project length. And if you want to look at the QR code or the link, will take you to the cost per mile models, the current cost per mile models. So for our new sidewalk, we know that it's 2 miles. Looking at the FDOT cost per mile model, about $350,000 per mile. That gets us to our base cost estimate of about $700,000. Next slide, please. So once we had the base costs, we were able to move on to our second sort of broad step in the estimation methodology, which involved applying a cost buffer to account for variations in project difficulty. The factors that were considered in developing that complexity score included looking at the geographic location, drainage impacts, right-of-way needs, environmental sensitivity for each of the projects in the needs assessment. And these factors were evaluated for each project, and then a complexity score was assigned to that project. And then based on the complexity score, a cost percentage increase was applied, as noted on the slide here. So during the reviews for the needs assessment, we were also able to gather input from our local agency project sponsors so they could recommend adjustments to these project complexity factors based on their local knowledge. Next slide, please. So this slide just walks us through that application of the complexity factor. In this case, we're assuming that our sidewalk project has a medium complexity factor, so we're going to add a 50% increase in the cost. So we apply our base cost of about $700,000 times the 1 plus the 50% increase. That gets us to a little over $1 million for our example project. Next slide, please. So that was a really brief overview of the work that the cost estimation team has completed. This exact methodology is meant to be a high-level, conservative screening to support our development of the 2050 MTP in a fiscally constrained manner, as I mentioned before. And the methodology I just walked through has been applied to all of the projects that were identified through the needs assessment and will also be applied to any new projects that are added through the amendment process between the adoption of this 2050 MTP and our next MTP update. Next slide. So that's all I have, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have on what we did.
Thank you so much, Laura. As a reminder, please use the raise your hand feature if you have any questions, or type them directly into the chat pod or the Q&A box located on your Zoom screen. I'm not seeing anything pop up yet. We'll wait another few seconds in case people are typing. Okay, looks like you covered it perfectly, Laura. No questions.
All right, thank you.
So if anyone does have any questions, just put them into the Q&A box or the chat pod, and we'll circle back around to those towards the end of the meeting. Thank you so much. So thank you, Laura. Now we're going to shift our discussion to show how this information culminates into the funding scenario work that we'll be completing this year, and then review the initial survey results from what we talked about late last year in 2024. So to set the stage for the scenario planning work, there are kind of 4 key elements that we really need. The first is the completed needs assessment with projects identified to address those needs. Again, our transportation to-do list. Then we need the projects on that to-do list to be prioritized. And that's where we are applying that prioritization methodology that we talked about in 2024 to be able to get the order in which we will address those projects. From there, we also need the revenue forecasts, which serve as our budgetary control totals. And then we have these first 3 items, which are complete at this point in time. And today we're going to be focusing on the 4th item of funding policy. The funding policy is our guide to how we spend the limited funding available within our region programmatically to be able to address as many of the needs as we can while still accomplishing the goals and objectives of the 2050 MTP. So the purpose of the funding scenarios is to evaluate how changes in funding allocations change the transportation projects that are funded within our 3-county area. As we develop different scenarios, we will be reviewing tangible comparisons between them to be able to understand the implications of one scenario versus another. And together, we will work to build consensus on a preferred funding scenario, which will be used to develop the MTP cost feasible plan later this year. So as I started hinting at on the previous slide, the scenarios that we develop should support the 2050 MTP goals and objectives, help us achieve our regional performance measures, and also provide us with the flexibility to adapt over time as trends and technology continue to evolve. So as we look at the transportation projects themselves, they are usually implemented using a combination of funding sources from federal, state, local, and potentially toll funding. Now, in terms of these different funding types, there are different rules associated with each one. So we're going to briefly mention those and really focus in on the federal elements today. So in terms of state funding sources, those are programmed by FDOT in consultation with the MPO in cases where that's applicable. Local funding sources are programmed by our local governments, including their Board of Commissioners and local councils. And then toll funds can only be spent on toll roads, and those are programmed by the Central Florida Expressway Authority and the Florida Turnpike Enterprise, respectively. So as we develop the funding scenarios for our 2050 MTP, we're really going to be focusing on a portion of the federal funding category. So in the federal category, there are 2 types of funds, those of which that are distributed directly to the state and non-urban attributable funds. And then there are the federal MPO funds, or the more formal title, urban attributable TMA funds. And those funds are distributed to Metroplan Orlando and other MPOs throughout the state. As we develop policies and scenarios for the 2050 MTP, they're going to be focusing exclusively on the urban attributable TMA funds or MPO funds. You might hear those 2 terms interchangeably this afternoon, for which we have that programming authority. And just one other reminder, I know we've talked about this previously in prior meetings, but these urban attributable funds, while they're programmed per Metro Plan Orlando's funding policies, they are administered via FDOT's local agency program, their LAP program. So it's very important for our local agencies as projects move forward and they're ready to get the funding to complete them to maintain their LAP certification. So they're eligible to receive those funds to implement the project. So when we look to our current funding policy, this is the recommended funding scenario from the 2045 Metropolitan Transportation Plan. It is based on those urban attributable TMA funds, those MPO funds that we were just talking about, and does not include any state, toll, or local funding. The funding policy divides the TMA funds across 4 different categories, including complete streets, transit, bicycle and pedestrian improvements, as well as transportation systems management and operation improvements. And here you can see the percentages of the funding that was available and how it was distributed across those 4 modal categories. So why are we really focusing so much on this? The funding policy provides structure to the prioritization approach and programming of projects and how we get them into the work program and our transportation improvement program over the lifetime of the plan. Our current approach allows us to have a greater number of projects to be funded by allocating about $4 million per project phase from an annual budget of approximately $40 million per year. And our current approach also allows us to have a wider variety of projects to be funded by creating separate dedicated funding sources for each of those 4 types of projects. This also allows us to have projects flow fairly seamlessly through the MPO planning process as they begin in the MTP, are then shortlisted on the prioritized project list if they are determined to be cost feasible in the long range plan, and then ultimately programmed in both the Transportation Improvement Program and the FDOT Work Program concurrently. The 4 categories that we mentioned on the previous slide from our 2045 plan, that funding policy structure is actually the exact same structure that you see in our PPL and the TIP. So you can effectively map those projects from the long range to the midterm to the near term plans. And it helps organize these projects in a way across our documents to showcase that progress as they move forward. So as we look to 2050, we need to revisit the funding scenarios and revise them to be able to achieve our region's goals, because things have changed since we were talked about this 5 years ago. So the first question, are we including the right modal categories in our funding policy? Should there be fewer categories or should there be more? Do we need to change the size of these particular categories, increase the percentage for one mode versus another, or decrease it? Should the funding amounts be distributed differently amongst the modal programs? Or are there other considerations that we need to include to be able to accomplish the goals of the 2050 MTP? These are a lot of the questions we're going to be exploring through the funding scenario development and what we started asking you about in our survey back at the end of 2024. So we asked you, as well as the public, several of these questions through surveys, and we've received some really good feedback and thought-provoking comments that we're going to be exploring today. Now, the first question that we asked, basically, what slices would you include on the pie? What modal categories should be included in a funding scenario? So most of the project types that we suggested were supported by our technical partners. So those of you who participated in the survey, and the public responses did align overall with those preferred categories too, which was good to see that consistency throughout the region. One item to note where you will see a bit of a disparity was on safety. That was due to a difference in the wording of the question. For the public, they were asked about safety in general and not to differentiate between on-system or off-system safety. Just was safety a category that they wanted to see a significant focus on. And the public was not asked about a goes with 3R program. So then our second question really focused on what are the sizes of those funding allocations to each of those modal categories. So how would you slice the pie to continue with the pie chart metaphor? So our technical workshop respondents reduced the allocations across all of the categories from the current funding policy from the 2045 plan to be able to incorporate dedicated safety funding, which was good to see. Um, and extra good to see because we saw that with the public responses as well. They were also reducing some of the funding allocations per these categories from the 2045 process. And their primary difference between the technical responses and those of the public was to show higher allocations for transit and safety. So again, the questions for the public did not differentiate between safety on system or off system, nor did we ask the public about a goes with program. So the key themes that we gleaned from the survey included a desire to see a focus of MPO funding or those TMA funds on off-system projects, a focus to see MPO funding on standalone projects instead of any goes with type programs. And then from the public, we saw that all of the funding options were equally important to them to be considered, but there was a desire to have dedicated higher amounts of funding for safety and transit. Then a few other comments that we received through the survey included requests to change the Complete Streets policy to allow MPO funds for roadway widening or capacity type projects, a desire to revisit that $4 million funding limit per project phase, so that limit for MPO funds upon initial programming that we mentioned earlier, and then also a desire to revisit the topic of local match funding commitments. So we were surprised and intrigued by these survey responses. So we're going to be spending a significant amount of time today to discuss these items in preparation for the next steps of the MTP's development and crafting those funding scenarios. But before we jump into that discussion, are there any questions at this point in the meeting? As a reminder, please use the raise your hand feature if you have any questions or type them directly into the chat box or the Q&A box. And not seeing anything popping up on my screen. I think that's a sign that we're ready to dive straight into the discussion today. So I will turn it over to Alex Trauger, who will be facilitating our discussion this afternoon. Alex?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Taylor. As Taylor mentioned, and as she went over with the survey findings, both at your technical advisory committee meetings, but also the overview today, we had some consensus, and then we had some areas that we want to spend a little more time better understanding and kind of contextualizing the feedback that we received. So as we get into some of our next step scenario and funding sketch planning, that we can go into that exercise with a little more understanding about what the sentiment is, both especially from our local agency partners. So we're over the next couple slides, we're going to scratch a little deeper, scratch at the surface of some of those polling questions that we had talked originally surveyed you on, and both use internal Zoom polling, but also as we're going through the next set of topics, I implore each of you to, again, use the poll as will be prompted on Zoom, but at the same time, use the chat feature to add feedback, insights, thoughts from and perspective from your jurisdictions about the topics as they come up. So with that, we can go to the next slide. We'll jump right into that first topic. And this is one that we've heard a lot about, especially over the past 2 years, and looking to strategize ways to make the most of the resurfacing opportunities that are presented to us. So as it relates to the original poll, there was relatively limited support for us boxing funds or setting aside funds to support the DOT resurfacing program and to see those local agency goes with safety or other operational improvements included in those projects. So this is our first poll here, and Leilani, if you can please launch that first poll. And the question is, both in poll prompt, but also in the Q&A after you respond, in the 2050 MTP, as part of our funding policy, should we set aside a portion of federal funds to be boxed up to be utilized on an annual basis to support FDOT's 3R, or in some cases, the pavement only option? So we'll give you guys a few seconds to respond. And as I mentioned, we'll let that poll go on here for another 30 seconds or so, but please do. Seeing a note, Taylor, from a couple that panelists are unable at this time to leverage the poll, utilize the poll.
Leilani, would you please go through and adjust that setting to be able to allow panelists to respond and then restart the poll?
Thank you, everyone, or thanks for those who panelists who.
Let me go ahead and try that. Retry.
So give us a couple seconds. Give y'all another moment to kind of reflect and think about that. But as I mentioned, you can also use that chat feature to elaborate on your sentiment on this particular one. But we'll give us just another moment to relaunch that poll. Right now, just for everyone's awareness, the resurfacing program is a formula-based program that comes directly, that DOT works with central office. The funds that are set aside for pavement resurfacing and is very limited, and as we've seen over the past couple of years, those costs have increased along with other construction costs, and with that, DOT's had to leverage the pavement maintenance or pavement only projects. So this set aside could be a way for us to implement goes with safety and other operational improvements, but we yield it back, and we'll have that poll up and running here in just a moment.
So, Alex, in the interest of time, since this one's a yes/no question, perhaps we use the chat pod to be able to respond with yeses or nos to this first question.
Sounds good. Yeah, let's do that. I think all panelists and attendees can use the chat box. You can simply answer yes or no if you want to, or if you want to elaborate. We appreciate that. Leilani, do we have the poll back up and running as well?
It is running for the attendees to be able to go ahead and put their answer in.
So yeah, let's go ahead and everyone on this particular one just continue to use the chat feature, so everyone has the opportunity to participate who's on the call. I'm seeing a lot of yeses, great majority yeses. Seeing some other feedback as it relates to a desire to see the state itself, reconsider its resurfacing and safety policy. I know that was some sentiment that was expressed at our last technical advisory committee meeting during the tentative work program presentation. So certainly understood. In the absence of that, we want to look to other options as well, just to make sure that we have other alternatives in the event that things do not change. So I'm seeing a lot of yeses. I'm seeing some general feedback with, this needing to be a shared responsibility, and then others acknowledging that they, would still like to see DOT revisit the state's resurfacing policy to maybe do a little less resurfacing, to do more value added improvements on those fewer resurfacing projects. So this is really helpful. This is really good. The feedback that we've gotten so far is kind of the context, or is exactly the type of context that we want to see in your responses to the next upcoming questions. Lalani, were we able to resolve the polling issue with panelists not able to participate in the poll?
At this time, no, the settings were all checked before we started this meeting, so I'm not sure. We probably will have to just moving forward, keep using the chat for the panelists, and the attendees are the ones that will be able to use the poll feature.
Understood. We'll continue that accordingly. We'll just go ahead and continue using the poll, the chat option. I think that allows people to contextualize their responses as well, which is extremely helpful to us. I want you to know kind of the binary response is helpful, but this extra context allows us to kind of frame the issue and present it to our board in some of our next step activities. So a lot of consensus here on yes. But this is something that we're going to definitely have to bring back to the board, talk about options, talk about roles and responsibilities, just given the full range of feedback that we have received in the past, but also validated today. So I appreciate everyone's feedback on poll question number 1. If we can go to the second slide, a similar question, or similar in a way, not relating to resurfacing necessarily, but given that coming out of our Vision Zero and high injury network exercise, and Taylor, thank you so much for putting this poll question as a multiple choice option that'll help with some of our coding after the fact. So Taylor just prompted an A, B, or C response, and I'll go to that in a second. But our Vision Zero exercise identified a lot of safety challenges on the state highway system. Our regional high injury network primarily is state highway facilities. With that being the case, we're posing the question, reposing the question as we have in the past. We talked about having a safety slice. How broad should that slice be? Should it be for all safety projects, agnostic to ownership and jurisdiction? Should it only be for off-state highway system facilities? So facilities that local government or projects that local governments will pursue on roads that are federally eligible, or again, both. So we have A for state roads, B for off-system, and C for both. Oops. Seeing a lot of C's, a couple B's are coming in, a lot of C's. Safety. So we'll give you guys another couple seconds here. Appreciate everyone's flexibility this afternoon. Our agility is notable here. All right, so the responses are slowing down. I would say, the majority of responses are saying both, that we should focus safety funding, federal urban attributable safety funding on both the state highway system to support FDOT's projects and endeavors, but also to dedicate funds for safety to be leveraged by our local partners to implement actions that are in their localized Vision Zero action plan. So a lot of good feedback there. I appreciate everyone's participation on this particular one as well. So we can go ahead and go to the third topic, which relates to, and this was a comment, it wasn't a question that we originally posed in the survey. This was one of those open response comments that we got, and that was or let me take a step back. Current MPO policy does not allow for MPO urban attributable SU funds to be used for off-system widening projects. That was a policy made by the board a few years ago. Probably about 6 or 7 years ago now, as part of our complete streets policy development. But there was the question, legally, the funds can be used for off-system widening, adding lane capacity. The board's policy, as I mentioned, is to exclude that project type. But we want to pose the question here, given that we are at this funding policy inflection point, should our limited SU funds or urban attributable funds be utilized for off-system roadway widening projects if they also include pedestrian and bicycle facilities? So a 2-lane road with a widening, maybe a side path and continuous sidewalks. I'm seeing a lot of no's. But we'll give it just a couple more, just another moment, so we can get a few additional responses here. So currently, none of our MPO, urban attributable federal funds, are dedicated to off-system widening. In the absence of this funding policy, local governments would have to leverage their own locally generated revenues, or pursue discretionary grant opportunities. So majority no, we have a handful of yeses. But I would say the great majority of participants are suggesting to keep the complete streets policy in project type as is to exclude roadway capacity projects. So great feedback. I appreciate everyone's insights on this. And again, if you have other context or kind of other thoughts that you want to express beyond just yes or no, you can certainly use the chat throughout this process to articulate that. So let's go ahead and move on to the next question, our fourth question. And this gets back to leveraging the limited or finite federal funds that we have. Currently, our initial federal maximum programming amount per phase is $4 million. This was a policy that was instituted by our Technical Advisory Committee and Systems Management and Operations Advisory Committee years ago. Historically, it was $4 million per project. You could see how that could be problematic in today's terms. About 6 years ago, that was reframed to be $4 million per phase. The construction phase is typically where we run into maximum programming challenges, as you could imagine. But the question here, revisiting that amount, should we increase the initial federal MPO urban attributable programming value for any given project? As we look at our needs assessment, we went into that process, as Taylor mentioned, and as Laura mentioned, trying to right-size projects so we would live within our current policy. But if that is expanded, we could certainly review priorities. I think the average, as I'm looking at some of the average project costs from our needs assessment on the average construction cost, most projects are in that $2 to $3 million average construction cost. But I will say our complete streets, when we look at the comprehensive complete streets list, we are seeing the average construction cost about $7 million per mile for construction of a complete street, an urban corridor, off-system urban corridor improvement. So with that being said, if the policy stays as is, the local government will need to, provide that match moving forward. So I'm seeing a lot of yeses, acknowledging circumstance and cost increases. We'll go ahead and, as staff, take a look at varying options for what that could be, unless the technical workshop participants saying all yeses. I don't think we have a single no in queue. Is there a dollar value or threshold maximum that we should consider? And again, you can use the Q&A or the chat to offer insights on what we should increase that maximum two. As I mentioned, the majority of our projects, when we average the costs, they are under that $4 million value, but our complete streets, given that it's a road, in most cases, a roadway reconstruction project, does have a higher construction cost of about $7 million for the construction phase. So any feedback on, thank you, Kelly, for some initial notes. And what we'll do, I know you guys are everyone's coming off the cuff with kind of what that new policy should be. We'll take your feedback here. We're also going to revisit the full comprehensive set of needs that we have. So when we come to that April workshop, we'll be able to have some tangibles of what that actually looks like based on varying changes in that federal share. So appreciate the feedback that we've gotten so far on that. And then the last question, if we can go to the next slide, and this is our final poll, and then we'll kind of pause for a group discussion to revisit them all. But this was another topic that came up in our open-ended question, and it relates to local match requirements. Currently, Metro Plan Orlando does not have a match requirement. There are costs that are federally ineligible that local agencies must pay for. But this is looking at more of leveraging those limited federal funds should there be a required local match, or should it remain as is and locals only paying for those non-federally eligible expenditures. So if you're voting yes, you're saying we should include a requirement. If you're saying no, it's kind of a status quo. So I'll give you guys some time. And thank you, Taylor, for putting that question in chat again. So it's a yes or no question here. Should there be a required local agency match, as there is for many federal grants? Currently and historically, Metro Plan Orlando has not required a local match. I will say from my experience across the state, some MPOs do require local agency matches and hold agencies accountable for those matches in the programming steps. So again, an inflection point for us to consider as part of our planning process. Seeing some good feedback here. No match requirements. There are some yeses. I would say majority no's. Again, we're going to go back and cross-reference all of these findings here, and we'll report that back to you in the meeting summary, given the survey instrument the chat box that we're using today. How we've handled shortfalls in the past is, on a case-by-case basis based on the limited funding contingency that we have available to us. So there are instances where a cost increase goes up, or what we call a shortfall occurs. And oftentimes Metro Plan Orlando is able to add federal funds, urban attributable funds to projects. But as some of you know, there are other instances where we're not able to do that based on financial and budgetary constraints. So I think this is another one that we'll definitely want to take to our board during our April workshop, and you'll be involved in that as well. We'll talk more about that later. Just given the financial implication, given the local budget implications, and also as it relates to timing of the programming. So again, something that came up, as a open-ended response, but at the same time, we figured we'd scratch a little deeper at this particular topic. And I appreciate those who are offering some additional insights and are being more specific in their responses. This is super helpful for us in our next steps as we're trying to put some scenarios together for y'all's, some tangible scenarios for y'all's review. All right. We're covered as it relates to questions and feedback that we've received in the Q&A, and we're still receiving a lot of good feedback in the chat, so I do appreciate that. Again, I appreciate y'all being flexible with us this afternoon, and given some of our surveying issue. But that's all I have as it relates to some of those additional questions that we wanted to scratch a little bit deeper at the surface. But with that, I wanted to kind of open up the floor. If we can go to the next slide, to see if there's any of these particular topics that anyone, I know we've used the chat box, but if there's any of these topics that the group or anyone wants to revisit or speak to orally, please use your raise hand feature, and we can recognize you, and you can share your thoughts with the larger group. Or if there's any other general questions, things we've missed, other topics that we should explore and survey partners on. So we'll give you guys a moment to think about that and to use the chat and or raise hand feature to offer that feedback. I won't be calling anyone out today, I promise, friends. Taylor, I'm seeing the chat slowing down as well as the Q&A, so I'll hand things back over to you.
That's what I was just seeing too. Thank you so much, Alex, for guiding us through that discussion. And thank you everyone for your feedback this afternoon. This is really going to help us make sure that we're crafting those funding scenarios per kind of the vision that we all have for the region in terms of our transportation funding. There was one question that came through in the Q&A pod. I just want to make sure that that was noted. There is a written response that was included, but there was a request to revisit question number 3. So in terms of those responses, it came out to about a 50-50 split. So question 3 was asking about should the MPO funding policy be expanded to allow for roadway widening projects if that project does include pedestrian and bicycle features. Between the panelist responses through the chat and those on the public side who are responding, we had about 12 yeses and 13 nos, if my count is accurate, live from the chat pod. So thank you so much, Sarah, for helping to count those up. But we will be following up with a more formal set of summary responses based on the feedback we've received today at our upcoming meetings, as well as those who are on our MPO board or committees. You'll be able to see those summaries at your future meetings as well. And I'm not seeing any other questions or open items in the Q&A pod. Oh, there was a question about what was the result of question 6. We didn't have a question 6. We had a surprise kind of 4B type question about if we were to increase that federal funding amount from $4 million to some other amount, what would that be? So thank you to those who had responded in chat to that. If you would like to offer your response now, also through chat, just let us know which question you're answering. That'll be really helpful for us as we compile the feedback. So with the feedback that we've received today, we will be sharing that, as I mentioned, with our MPO board and committees, so we know what we're using to be able to help guide the development of those funding scenarios. And they're going to be used to help curate those funding scenarios for evaluations. And I know you're all probably excited to see when we're going to see those. So starting in April of this year, we're going to be evaluating and discussing those initial scenarios, what they look like, what they tangibly mean, how they compare and contrast to one another. And we'll be asking for feedback on those scenarios in April. For our MPO board and committee members, there will be an in-person summit, and there's additional information about that that's been shared with you. For those who are on our technical workshop, venue here. We will be going over that same and similar information in a shorter format to be able to provide you with the opportunity to share your feedback and thoughts on these as well. Once we go through and review those initial iterations of these funding scenarios in April, we receive the feedback both from our board and committee members and you here at the technical workshop. We'll be refining those different scenarios and bringing back new iterations for you to review at the June technical workshop. So ultimately trying to iterate, refine, and build consensus towards the recommended funding scenario, which we will then be able to review together in the July and August timeframe. The recommended funding scenario is what is used to develop the MTP cost feasible plan and is the recommendation that would move forward upon the adoption of the 2050 MTP. So with that critical path, that highlights the key schedule components for us to be able to adopt the 2050 MTP in December of this year. So there are some pretty critical milestones that you're going to be seeing through these meetings throughout the year. So I do encourage your continued attendance and participation so you can help provide feedback as we work to build consensus on those recommendations. So are there any questions or other items that we wanted to discuss today while we're all together? This is kind of our open comment, open discussion period. As a reminder, please do use the raise your hand feature located at the bottom of your Zoom screen, continue using the chat pod, or put your question into the Q&A box. I am not seeing any hands raised. There was one new question in the Q&A box. There was a question about what about the requirement to match funding? I'm guessing that's a request to ask about what the results were of question number 5. So from what we were seeing, that was pretty much an even split. If my quick counting is accurate, likely a 40-60, 50-50 even split. So that's something that we're going to be further discussing with our MPO board at their next meeting so we can have some direction to be able to move forward with the development of these funding scenarios. Because that would be a new topic for us to discuss here at MetroPlan Orlando. Are there any other questions, comments, items for discussion?
Taylor, there's a question from Kelly as it relates to cost estimates. It's for Laura, but I think you may, or you or
Oh,
Laura may be able to
thank you.
answer it. As it relates to our cost estimation approach, does it include design or just construction? Laura, thank you. I see Laura's response. But I think, Taylor, will you expound on that and note the exact phases that are included in our cost estimation approach?
Mm-hmm. I was just looking for my chat pod and it disappeared off my screen, so my apologies for missing that one. But in terms of the cost estimates themselves, what we were using in those examples shown on the slides were the construction cost estimates, but the overall design, right-of-way, environmental, CEI, those are in our general categories based on percentages of those construction costs. And it does vary by the type of project that is being evaluated and estimated. So as we kind of move forward with updating our dashboard for the 2050 projects to be able to showcase those needs as well as the prioritization survey results, you'll be able to see a little bit more about what those cost estimates look like for those individual projects. And again, as Laura said at the beginning of the meeting, where we had a pre-existing individual project cost that had been estimated either by one of our prior master plan efforts, the Vision Zero efforts, or if a local agency had a very specific project cost estimate that they were super confident about and wanted us to use, those are the ones that we have directly incorporated into the 2050 MTP for this exercise. And where a pre-existing cost estimate did not exist, that is where these per mile cost estimates have been applied. Okay. Are there any other questions, comments? Anything else I may have missed in the chat that you want to repost just to make sure it gets answered? Okay, I saw one new question come in the chat. There are a few invitations for future MTP events. So for those who are on our MPO board or committees, you will see an invitation for an April 9th in-person summit, as well as for those who are here in the technical workshop space, you will receive an invitation for the April 10th technical workshop, which will be our 8th technical workshop. From there, they're going to return to the every 2 months meeting schedule. So that way you'll be able to see the technical workshop in June, August, and then October before we go to adoption for 2050 in December. So for those who are on our MPO committees and board, these meetings are also already included on your list of meetings for the entire calendar year. And you can feel free to reach out to us one-on-one so we can help make sure that you've got your calendar all set up and ready to go. So you've got the time reserved. Are there any other questions or items we want to cover? Wait a little bit longer. Okay, not seeing any. We'll go ahead and open this up for public comments. So if there are any members of the public who've joined into our meeting this afternoon, please use the raise your hand feature in Zoom to let us know that you would like to be recognized. Lisa, do we have any hands raised for public comment?
Taylor, I do not see any hands raised.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, if anyone does have any questions or would like to share their thoughts from the public, please reach out to mtp@metroplanorlando.gov to submit your question or comment to us. We'll be able to follow up with you from there. So in reference to those upcoming meetings, we've got the next 3 listed here on the slide for you. That MTP Summit for our board and committee members will be on April 9th. That is in person. Our next technical workshop will be the very next day on April 10th. That will be a virtual afternoon meeting. And then our 9th technical workshop will be on June 12th at 2 p.m., again in the virtual space. So thank you everyone for your active participation in this 2050 MTP technical workshop. You will receive calendar invitations for these items if you have not already in your inboxes in the near future. So thank you again, everyone, for your participation today and all of your feedback. We greatly appreciate it. And we do hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.